When arrogant Blake Reynolds is forced to work at the rundown Oakridge Community Center as punishment for his reckless lifestyle, he never expects to meet Elena Martinez, the passionate director who sees right through his facade. What begins as a court-ordered sentence becomes a journey that will transform them both in ways neither could imagine. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The black Mercedes screeched to a halt in the nearly empty parking lot, its sleek surface reflecting the gray clouds gathering overhead. Blake Reynolds sat behind the wheel, designer sunglasses hiding his bloodshot eyes, his knuckles white against the leather steering wheel. The court-mandated community service paper lay crumpled on the passenger seat. 80 hours at the Oakridge Community Center. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, glancing at the modest brick building with its faded sign and overgrown garden beds. The son of tech mogul Richard Reynolds shouldn't be spending his summer picking up trash and babysitting underprivileged kids. His father could have made this disappear with one phone call. Instead, he'd let the judge throw the book at Blake after that unfortunate incident with the yacht and the marina security. "Learn some responsibility," his father had said. "Understand the value of work." Easy words from a man who'd made his first million before 30 and now ran Reynolds Innovations, one of the country's leading tech companies. Blake checked his watch, an obscenely expensive timepiece that cost more than what most people at this community center probably made in months. He was already 15 minutes late for his first day, but what did it matter? They should be grateful he showed up at all. With a deep sigh that carried the weight of unearned privilege, Blake stepped out of his car. His Italian leather shoes seemed absurdly out of place on the cracked concrete. As he approached the entrance, a group of children raced past him, their laughter echoing against the building walls. One small boy bumped into his legs, leaving a smudge on his designer pants. "Watch it," Blake snapped, brushing at the mark with irritation. The boy looked up, wide-eyed and fearful. "Sorry, mister," he whispered before running off to join his friends. Blake felt a twinge of something unfamiliar. Shame, perhaps, but quickly dismissed it. He wasn't here to make friends with these kids. He was here to serve his time and get back to his real life. The community center's interior was better than he expected, though far from the luxury he was accustomed to. Clean hallways lined with children's artwork, the smell of paint and cleaning supplies, the distant sound of a basketball bouncing in a gymnasium. A middle-aged woman with kind eyes sat at the reception desk, sorting through papers. "Can I help you?" she asked, looking up as Blake approached. He removed his sunglasses, fixing her with the charming smile that had gotten him out of trouble so many times before. "Blake Reynolds. I'm supposed to start community service today." The woman's expression shifted slightly, recognition flickering in her eyes. The Reynolds name carried weight, even here. "Of course, Mr. Reynolds. Ms. Martinez is expecting you. She's in her office down the hall, last door on the right." Blake nodded, not bothering to thank her as he strode down the hallway. Framed photographs lined the walls. Children playing sports, teens working on art projects, families gathered at what looked like community events. All smiling, all looking unreasonably happy in their modest surroundings. How simple their lives must be, he thought. The door to the director's office was open. Blake paused in the doorway, momentarily taken aback by what he saw. He'd expected an older woman, stern and matronly. Instead, he found himself looking at a young woman, perhaps a year or two older than his 27 years. She sat behind a cluttered desk, phone pressed to her ear, expression intense as she scribbled notes on a legal pad. "I understand the budget constraints," she was saying, "but these children need the summer program. Many of them have nowhere else to go while their parents work." A pause. "Yes, I know it's expensive, but I've secured partial funding from 3 local businesses already." Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, revealing high cheekbones and determined brown eyes. She wore no makeup that Blake could detect, just a simple blouse and what appeared to be a well-worn blazer hanging on the back of her chair. She looked up, noticing him in the doorway. Her expression didn't change, but she held up one finger, asking him to wait. "I'll email you the revised proposal by tomorrow morning. Thank you for considering it." She hung up and fixed Blake with an appraising look. "Mr. Reynolds, I presume? You're late." No charmed smile, no flicker of recognition at his family name. Just a straightforward observation that left no room for excuses. "Traffic." Blake lied smoothly, stepping into the office. Elena Martinez didn't invite him to sit, but he did anyway, dropping into the chair across from her desk with practiced nonchalance. Her office was small, but organized, walls covered with children's thank you notes, certificates, and what looked like graduate degree diplomas. "I'm Elena Martinez, director of Oakridge Community Center," she said, setting aside her notes. "Judge Williams sent over your paperwork. 80 hours of community service for reckless endangerment and destruction of property." Blake waved a dismissive hand. "A misunderstanding. I'm sure we can make this easy on both of us. Maybe you could just sign off on my hours, and I'll make a generous donation to your—" He glanced around the modest office facility. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us." Now back to the story. Elena's expression hardened, her brown eyes cooling to a dangerous degree. "Mr. Reynolds, I run a community center, not a corruption scheme. You'll work every one of your 80 hours, and there'll be actual work, not just showing up." She pulled out a folder and slid a paper across the desk. "This is our code of conduct and your schedule. You'll be here Monday through Thursday, noon to 5. Blake's practiced smile faltered. "That's 20 hours a week. Basic math. You'll be done in 4 weeks. Unless you'd prefer to stretch it out longer?" Blake grabbed the paper, not bothering to read it. 4 weeks is fine. What exactly will I be doing? Signing autographs? Taking photos with donors?" Elena's laugh was short and genuine, catching Blake off guard. "You'll be doing whatever we need. Cleaning, organizing supplies, helping with programs. Today, you can start by repainting the benches outside. They're weathered, and the children get splinters." "I'm not a handyman," Blake protested, looking down at his expensive clothes. "There's a staff bathroom where you can change. I assumed you'd bring appropriate attire, but if not, we have some community center t-shirts and old jeans in the donation box." The thought of wearing someone else's cast-offs made Blake's skin crawl. "I'll bring my own clothes tomorrow," he said stiffly. Elena stood, signaling the end of their conversation. "The maintenance closet is down the hall. Ramon will show you where the painting supplies are kept." She fixed him with a direct gaze that made him inexplicably uncomfortable. "One more thing, Mr. Reynolds. The children and families who come here deserve respect. If I hear that you've been rude or dismissive to anyone, your hours won't count for that day." Blake stood as well, towering over her petite frame, yet somehow not feeling the advantage of his height. "Understood, Ms. Martinez." He couldn't keep the sarcasm from his voice. "I'll be on my best behavior. See that you are." She turned her attention back to her paperwork, dismissing him as easily as his father often did. Ramon turned out to be a cheerful man in his 60s who showed no deference to Blake's status or obvious discomfort. He chatted amicably as he showed Blake to a shed filled with tools and supplies, handing him a pair of coveralls that had seen better days. "These will protect your fancy clothes," Ramon said with a knowing smile. "The white paint, it gets everywhere." Blake accepted the coveralls reluctantly, slipping them on over his outfit. They smelled of paint and honest work. Scents entirely foreign to him. "The benches are around the playground," Ramon explained, handing Blake a wire brush and sandpaper. "Sand them down first to remove the rough spots. Then prime. Paint tomorrow when the primer is dry." "You're not staying to help?" Blake asked, suddenly feeling out of his depth. Ramon chuckled. "Ms. Martinez was clear. This is your project, start to finish." He patted Blake on the shoulder. "Don't worry, the work will go faster than you think." Blake found himself alone at the playground area, staring at wooden benches that had indeed seen better days. The afternoon sun beat down on him as he reluctantly began sanding the rough wood, his inexperienced hands quickly developing blisters. An hour into the work, sweat soaking through the coveralls, Blake was already regretting every decision that had led him to this moment. His back ached from bending over, his hands were raw, and the mindless labor gave him too much time to think. "You're doing it wrong." Blake looked up to find a young girl, perhaps 10 or 11, watching him with critical eyes. Her curly hair was pulled into 2 puffs, and she wore the serious expression of someone much older. "Excuse me?" Blake said, more surprised than offended. "The sanding. You're going against the grain. She demonstrated a smooth motion with her hand. "You should go with the grain of the wood, like this." Blake looked at the sandpaper in his hand, then at the girl. His instinct was to dismiss her, but something in her confident stance gave him pause. "Show me," he said. The girl approached, taking the sandpaper from him and demonstrating the proper technique. "See? Smoother this way. Less splinters for you. Better finish for the bench." Blake watched, genuinely impressed. "How do you know this stuff?" "My grandpa's a carpenter. I help him sometimes." She handed the sandpaper back. "I'm Zoe." "Blake," he replied, consciously leaving off his last name. Something told him it wouldn't impress this serious-eyed child anyway. "You're new," Zoe observed. "Are you a volunteer?" Blake hesitated. "Something like that." Zoe nodded sagely. "We need more help around here. Ms. Elena tries to do everything herself." She looked over at the community center building with clear affection. "This place is important. My mom works 2 jobs, and I'd be home alone all summer if it wasn't for the center." Before Blake could respond, a whistle blew from the direction of the building. Zoe sighed. "That's for art class. I gotta go." She pointed at the bench. "Remember, with the grain." Blake watched her run off, then turned back to his task, adjusting his technique as she'd shown him. The work did go more smoothly. As he continued sanding, he found himself glancing occasionally at the community center, wondering what else happened behind those brick walls. By 5 o'clock, Blake had finished sanding all 6 benches and had applied primer to 3. His back screamed in protest as he straightened, his hands raw despite the work gloves Ramon had eventually brought him. As he cleaned up the supplies, he noticed Elena watching from the center's back door. "Finished for the day?" she asked, approaching to inspect his work. Blake stood a little straighter, inexplicably wanting her approval. "The last 3 need primer. I can finish tomorrow." Elena ran a hand over one of the primed benches, nodding slightly. "Not bad for your first day. You have a good eye for detail." The unexpected praise caught Blake off guard. "I had help," he admitted. "A girl named Zoe showed me how to sand properly." A smile softened Elena's features. "Zoe's one of our regulars. Her grandfather taught her everything he knows." She looked at Blake with new interest. Most people wouldn't take advice from a child. Blake shrugged, uncomfortable with her scrutiny. She clearly knew more than I did. "Humility doesn't seem like a Reynolds family trait," Elena observed, though her tone had lost some of its edge. "You know my family?" Blake asked, surprised. "Your father's company laid off 300 workers last year when they moved operations overseas. Several families who use our services were affected." Her voice was matter-of-fact, not accusatory, which somehow made it worse. Blake felt that unfamiliar twinge again. He'd barely paid attention when his father had announced the strategic restructuring. Those workers had been abstract numbers on a presentation slide during a board meeting he'd attended out of obligation. "I don't handle those decisions," he said defensively. "No, you just benefit from them." Elena sighed, seeming to regret her words. "I'm sorry. That wasn't fair. Your father's business practices aren't your responsibility. But aren't they in some way?" The thought came unbidden to Blake's mind. He'd never questioned the source of his privileged lifestyle before. "Same time tomorrow?" he asked, changing the subject. Elena nodded. "Bring clothes you don't mind getting paint on. The real work starts tomorrow." As Blake drove home to his luxury high-rise apartment, the blisters on his hands stinging against the leather steering wheel, he couldn't shake the image of Elena's face when she'd mentioned those laid-off workers. Not anger, as he might have expected, but disappointment, as if she'd hoped for better from the Reynolds family. His apartment felt emptier than usual that night. The minimalist furniture and expensive art that had always seemed so sophisticated now struck him as cold and impersonal. No children's artwork here. No thank-you notes pinned to walls. Just carefully curated pieces selected by an interior designer he'd hired to create a space that would impress others. Blake poured himself a generous whiskey and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. Somewhere out there was the Oakridge neighborhood, with its modest homes and its community center, where someone like Elena Martinez worked tirelessly for children like Zoe. His phone buzzed with messages from friends inviting him to a club opening. Blake ignored them, instead opening his laptop and typing Reynolds Innovations layoffs into the search bar. Article after article appeared, detailing the, quote, strategic restructuring that had moved jobs overseas to increase profit margins. Photos showed former employees with shell-shocked expressions, carrying boxes of personal items as they left the building for the last time. Blake closed the laptop, unable to continue reading. He'd never thought about the human cost of his family's wealth, had never had to. When he finally fell into bed, exhausted from physical labor his body wasn't accustomed to, Blake dreamed of wooden benches and serious-eyed children, and a woman who looked at him as if he could be better than he was. The next day, Blake arrived at the community center wearing old jeans he'd found in the back of his closet and a plain t-shirt. He'd left the luxury watch at home and driven his less ostentatious car. He was also, to his own surprise, 15 minutes early. The receptionist, Gloria, according to her nameplate, looked up in surprise. "Good morning, Mr. Reynolds. Ms. Martinez is in the gym with the summer program children." Blake nodded his thanks and headed toward the sounds of children's voices. The gymnasium was alive with activity, kids playing basketball, others working on art projects at tables set up along the walls, a group in one corner practicing what looked like a dance routine. In the midst of it all was Elena, her hair pulled back in that same practical ponytail, wearing jeans and a community center polo shirt. She was helping a young boy with what appeared to be a science project, her expression patient as she explained something about the model they were constructing. Blake watched for a moment, struck by how different she looked from yesterday. In this environment, surrounded by children, her face was animated, her smile ready and genuine. She seemed younger, less guarded. As if sensing his presence, Elena looked up. She said something to the boy, who nodded eagerly and continued working on his project, then made her way across the gym to Blake. "You're early," she observed, that same note of surprise he'd heard from Gloria. "Thought I'd get a head start on those benches." Blake replied with a casual shrug that belied the strange nervousness he felt under her gaze. Elena studied him for a moment, taking in his casual clothes and the lack of designer accessories. "The paint and supplies are where you left them yesterday. The morning group will be using the playground after lunch, so it would be good to have at least a few benches finished by then." "I'll make sure they're dry in time," Blake promised. As he turned to leave, a crash from across the gym caught their attention. A boy had knocked over an entire table of art supplies, paint splashing across the floor in a colorful disaster. The boy stood frozen, looking horrified as other children backed away from the spreading mess. Blake expected Elena to show frustration or anger. Instead, she immediately moved toward the child, kneeling to his level despite the paint that would surely stain her clothes. "Are you okay, Miguel? Did you get hurt?" Her voice carried across the gym, gentle and concerned. The boy shook his head, tears welling in his eyes. "I'm sorry, Ms. Elena. I was running and I slipped and—" "Accidents happen," Elena assured him, her hand on his shoulder. "Let's get this cleaned up together, okay?" Blake found himself moving forward without conscious thought. "I can help," he offered, surprising himself as much as Elena, whose eyebrows rose slightly. "That would be great," she said after a moment. "The cleaning supplies are in the closet by the entrance." For the next 20 minutes, Blake found himself on his hands and knees alongside Elena and Miguel, cleaning up spilled paint. Other children gradually joined in, turning what could have been a punishment into something almost resembling fun, as Elena made a game of identifying the mixed colors that resulted from the spill. "Look, Miguel," she said, pointing to where blue and yellow had merged on the floor. "What color did they make?" "Green," the boy answered, his earlier distress forgotten. "That's right. Like magic, isn't it?" Elena smiled, catching Blake's eye over the boy's head. Something passed between them. A moment of shared amusement, perhaps, or understanding. By the time the mess was cleaned up, Blake's t-shirt was splattered with paint, and he was inexplicably in a better mood than when he'd arrived. The simple act of helping, of being useful, had satisfied something in him he hadn't known needed satisfying. "Thank you," Elena said as they washed their hands at the sink in the corner. "You didn't have to do that." "Seemed like the right thing to do," Blake replied honestly. Elena gave him a searching look. "The benches can wait until after lunch. We're short-handed today. One of our regular volunteers called in sick. Would you mind helping with the science table?" Just supervising, making sure no one else knocks anything over. Blake wanted to refuse. He had no experience with children, no interest in science projects. But the expectant look in Elena's eyes made the word yes come out of his mouth before he could reconsider. And so Blake Reynolds, who had never volunteered for anything in his life, found himself sitting at a table with 4 children between the ages of 8 and 11, helping them build model solar systems and simple electrical circuits. To his surprise, the time passed quickly. The children asked endless questions, some of which he could actually answer, and their excitement when experiments worked was oddly infectious. By the time lunch arrived, Blake had almost forgotten why he was at the community center in the first place. The reminder came when Elena approached his table, a clipboard in hand. "I need to sign off on your hours for today," she said, all business again. "You've put in 3 so far. After lunch you can get back to those benches." Reality crashed back. This wasn't his world. He was here because a judge had ordered it, not because he belonged. "Right," Blake said, his voice cooling. "The benches." Something flickered in Elena's eyes. Disappointment again, or perhaps regret. "You did well with the kids," she offered. "They respond to genuine interest, and you gave them that." Had he? Blake wasn't sure. What he did know was that for a few hours he'd forgotten about being Blake Reynolds, forgotten about his image and his family name, and all the trappings of his usual life. As he headed outside to continue his assigned task, Blake caught a glimpse of Elena through the window, now sitting with children during their lunch, listening intently to their stories, laughing at their jokes. The sunlight caught her profile, highlighting the curve of her cheek, the slight smile that seemed never far from her lips when she was with the children. For the first time in his privileged life, Blake Reynolds felt a twinge of envy for someone with less than him. Elena Martinez might not have his wealth or status, but she had purpose. She mattered to these children, to this community. What, he wondered as he opened the paint can to finish the benches, did Blake Reynolds matter to? And why, suddenly, did that question seem so important? The weeks at Oakridge Community Center fell into an unexpected rhythm for Blake. The benches had been completed by the end of his first week, not just painted, but properly sealed against the weather after Ramon had shown him how. The children had cheered when they were finally allowed to sit on them, making Blake feel a strange pride in his workmanship. Now in his 3rd week, Blake found himself assigned to increasingly varied tasks. Today he was helping Elena sort through donations for the center's annual back-to-school drive. "These calculators are still in their packaging," Blake noted, organizing them into a box with other school supplies. Someone was generous. Elena looked up from the clothing she was sorting. "That would be Mrs. Abernathy. She buys new supplies every year for the children who can't afford them." Blake picked up a scientific calculator, remembering how he'd always had the latest technology growing up. "I never thought about kids not having basic school supplies. Many families here have to choose between school supplies and necessities like food or medicine," Elena said without judgment, simply stating facts. The drive helps ease that burden. Blake set down the calculator, a first question forming that he'd been wanting to ask for days. "How did you end up here, running this place?" Elena continued, folding a child-sized sweater, her movements precise. "I grew up in a neighborhood like this one. My parents worked multiple jobs, and places like Oakridge were my safe haven." She glanced at him. "Education was my way out. I got scholarships, worked my way through college and graduate school, and then came back," Blake observed. "I never wanted to leave permanently, just to gain the skills to make a difference." She placed the sweater in a box. "The real question is, why are you still showing up every day with such dedication? Your court-mandated hours only require the afternoon." Blake had been arriving at 9 each morning for the past week, staying until 6 or later. He'd told himself it was to complete his service faster, but that excuse rang hollow even to him. "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe I'm tired of being useless." Elena's expression softened. "You were never useless, Blake. Just unused." The distinction struck him as profound, though he wasn't sure why. Before he could respond, the door opened and Zoe burst in, her face alight with excitement. "Ms. Elena, the science competition permission slips are all signed," she exclaimed, waving a folder. Everyone can go. Elena accepted the folder with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. That's wonderful, Zoe. Why don't you go tell the others? We'll discuss transportation details tomorrow. After Zoe left, Blake noticed Elena's troubled expression. What's wrong? I thought the science competition was a good thing. It is, Elena sighed, but our van broke down last week. The repair costs are more than we can afford right now, and the competition is 30 miles away. She shook her head. I'll figure something out. I always do. Blake hesitated, then offered, I could drive some of them. My SUV seats 7. Elena looked surprised. That's generous, but the competition is next Saturday. Your service will be completed by then. Blake shrugged, affecting nonchalance. I don't have plans. Besides, Zoe showed me how to sand properly. I owe her. Elena studied him, a small smile playing at her lips. You're different from when you first arrived. Am I? Blake asked, genuinely curious. You don't check your watch every 5 minutes anymore, she observed. And you learned all the children's names. Blake hadn't realized she'd noticed such details. They're hard to forget once you know their stories. The conversation was interrupted by Ramon, who needed Elena's signature on supply orders. As she left, Blake found himself contemplating her words. Was he really different? And if so, what had changed? That evening, instead of heading home, Blake drove to his father's office. Reynolds Innovations occupied the top floors of a gleaming downtown skyscraper, a physical manifestation of Richard Reynolds' success. The security guard recognized Blake, waving him through to the private elevator. As he ascended to the executive floor, Blake felt the familiar mixture of resentment and desire for approval that his father always inspired. Richard Reynolds was on a call when Blake entered his corner office, but he waved his son to a seat across from his imposing desk. At 60, Richard remained formidable, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, and unyielding. He ended his call with curt efficiency. Blake, this is unexpected. I thought you'd be at that community center. His tone suggested both skepticism and disdain. I was. I just left. Blake met his father's gaze directly. The center needs a new van. Their old one broke down. Richard leaned back in his leather chair. And this concerns me how? You could donate one. A tax write-off for the company. Good publicity. Richard's eyebrows rose. Since when do you care about tax write-offs or community centers? They're doing important work, Blake said, surprised by his own conviction. The children there. Blake, Richard interrupted. If you've developed a sudden philanthropic streak, use your own money. You have plenty, thanks to the trust fund your grandfather left you. The dismissal stung, but Blake pressed on. The center's in the same neighborhood where Reynolds Innovations laid off those workers last year. It would be a gesture of goodwill. Richard's expression hardened. Business decisions aren't about goodwill, they're about sustainability and profit margins. Something you might understand if you ever took an interest in the company beyond the dividends it provides you. The words hit their mark. Blake had never shown much interest in the family business, preferring to live off his trust fund and inheritance from his mother. But now, he found himself thinking about those laid-off workers differently, as people with children like Zoe and Miguel, with bills to pay and futures to worry about. What if I do? Blake asked suddenly. Do what? Take an interest in the company. Learn the business. Richard's surprise was evident, quickly replaced by skepticism. You've had opportunities before. What's changed? Blake wasn't entirely sure himself. Maybe I have, he said finally. Richard studied his son for a long moment. We can discuss this after you've completed your community service. If you're still interested then, we'll talk. It wasn't the enthusiastic response Blake might have hoped for, but it was more than his father had offered before. He nodded, standing to leave. I'll still need the van, he said. I'll use my own money. Richard's expression was unreadable. As you wish. As Blake drove home, his father's skepticism echoed in his mind. What had changed? Why did he suddenly care about a community center van? About children he'd known for less than a month? About a company he'd always viewed as his father's domain? The answer came unbidden. Elena Martinez. Her dedication, her clear purpose, The way she believed people could be better than they appeared. It had awakened something in Blake, a desire to be worthy of that belief. The next morning, Blake arrived at the center earlier than usual, finding Elena in her office reviewing budget spreadsheets with a furrowed brow. "I have a proposition," he announced without preamble. Elena looked up, her expression guarded. "What kind of proposition?" "I'm buying a van for the center. For the science competition. And whatever else you need." Elena's eyes widened. "Blake, we can't accept that." "Why not? You need a van." "I have money sitting in accounts doing nothing useful." "It's too much," she insisted. "The center has policies about accepting large donations." Blake hadn't anticipated resistance. "It's just a van, not a bribe." "It's a major gift from someone completing court-ordered service," Elena explained patiently. "It creates an ethical gray area." Blake ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. "Then what can I do?" "Those kids are counting on getting to that competition." Elena considered for a moment. "If you want to help, do it properly. Submit a formal donation proposal to our board. They meet next week." "That's after the science competition," Blake pointed out. "For the immediate need," Elena said thoughtfully, "you could rent a van and volunteer as a driver. That's a service, not a donation." Blake brightened. "I can do that. And I'll submit the proposal for a permanent van." Elena studied him, curiosity evident in her expression. "Why is this so important to you?" The question caught him off guard. Blake found himself answering honestly. "Because for the first time in my life, I can see the direct impact of my actions. It's not abstract. It's Zoe getting to show off her science project. It's Miguel getting to school with proper supplies." He paused. "It matters in a way nothing in my life has before." Elena's smile was warm, reaching her eyes this time. "Write that in your proposal. The board will appreciate your sincerity." Something shifted between them in that moment. A mutual recognition, perhaps, that Blake's presence at Oakridge had become about more than fulfilling a court order. Later that day, as Blake helped with the afternoon tutoring program, he found himself working with Miguel on math problems. The boy's frustration was evident as he struggled with fractions. "I'm stupid," Miguel muttered after his third mistake. "No, you're not," Blake said firmly. "You're just looking at it the wrong way." He grabbed a sheet of paper, drawing a pizza. "If this pizza has 8 slices, and you eat 3, what fraction is left?" Miguel thought for a moment. 5/8? "Exactly. Now if I eat one more slice, what's left?" 4/8, Miguel said. Then his eyes lit up. "Wait! That's the same as 1/2. "See? You understand fractions," Blake said, feeling an unexpected satisfaction as Miguel beamed with newfound confidence. From across the room, Blake caught Elena watching them, a soft smile playing at her lips. When their eyes met, she didn't look away, and Blake felt something warm unfurl in his chest. The feeling lingered as he worked with other children throughout the afternoon. By the time most had left for the day, Blake found himself helping Zoe perfect her science project, a complex model demonstrating renewable energy sources. "The solar panel isn't generating enough power." Zoe frowned, adjusting wires on her contraption. Blake examined the setup. "The angle's wrong. The panel needs to face the light source directly." He helped her reposition it, and the small motor began to spin steadily. "It works!" Zoe exclaimed. "We're going to win that competition for sure now." "Your project is impressive," Blake acknowledged. "But remember, the point is what you've learned, not just winning." Zoe gave him a skeptical look. "That sounds like something adults say when they don't think you're going to win," Blake laughed. "Maybe. But I've learned recently that there are more important things than winning or being the best." "Like what?" Zoe challenged. Blake considered the question seriously. "Like making a difference. Creating something that helps others." He gestured to her renewable energy model. "Like what you're doing here." Zoe seemed to consider his words. "I guess. But winning would still be nice." Can't argue with that, Blake agreed. They were interrupted by Elena, who entered carrying a stack of flyers. Zoe, your grandmother's here to pick you up. After Zoe packed up her project and left, Elena handed Blake one of the flyers. Our annual fundraising gala, she explained. It's in 2 weeks. Blake scanned the simple flyer advertising a dinner and silent auction at a local event space. Seems modest. It's what we can afford, Elena said with a slight edge. We raise about $10,000 each year. It funds our summer program. Blake did some quick mental math. That's not much for a year-round program. We piece together funding from various sources, Elena explained. Grants, donations, community partnerships. It's always a struggle, but we make it work. Blake studied the flyer again, an idea forming. What if I could help make this year's gala more successful? Elena's expression was cautious. What did you have in mind? Connections, Blake said simply. My father's company works with people who could make significant donations. I could invite them. Why would they come to our modest community center gala? Because Blake Reynolds is asking them, he said, without his usual arrogance. It was simply a fact. His family name still carried weight. Let me make some calls. No promises, but I might be able to bring in people with deeper pockets. Elena hesitated, then nodded. If you can help without changing the character of the event, I'd appreciate it. This is still a community celebration, not a society ball. Understood, Blake assured her. I'll be respectful of that. As they closed up the center together, a comfortable silence fell between them. Blake found himself reluctant to leave, to break the easy companionship that had developed. Would you like to grab dinner? He asked impulsively. There's a good pizza place around the corner. Elena looked surprised, then guarded. Blake, I'm your supervisor for court-mandated service. My service hours ended at 5, he pointed out. Right now, I'm just a volunteer, asking another volunteer to share a meal and discuss fundraising strategies. A smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. Is that what we'd be discussing? Among other things, Blake admitted. Like how someone as brilliant as you ended up running a chronically underfunded community center instead of making 6 figures in the corporate world. That's easy, Elena said, gathering her purse. I believe in what I do here. Simple as that. Simple, but not easy. She hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. Pizza sounds good, but I pick the place. Somewhere the locals actually eat. The pizzeria Elena chose was small and family-owned, with checkered tablecloths and photographs of Italy on the walls. The owner greeted her by name, leading them to a corner table with practiced hospitality. Antonio's son graduated from our after-school program, Elena explained after they ordered. He's in college now, studying engineering. You keep track of all of them, don't you? Blake observed. The children who pass through Oakridge. As many as I can, she acknowledged. Their successes fuel the work. Their conversation flowed easily, moving from the center's programs to their own backgrounds. Blake learned that Elena had turned down corporate positions twice to continue her work at Oakridge. She'd been director for 5 years, gradually expanding programs despite constant funding challenges. What about you? She asked as they shared a dessert, cannoli that Antonio had insisted they try. What did you do before your community service sentence? Blake shifted uncomfortably. Nothing particularly meaningful. Traveled, dated models, spent money. He looked down at his plate. I was exactly the spoiled rich kid you thought I was. And now? Elena's gaze was direct, challenging. Now, I'm not sure who I am, Blake admitted. But I know who I don't want to be anymore. Elena nodded, understanding in her eyes. That's usually how change begins. As they walked back toward the community center where their cars were parked, the evening air was warm and fragrant with summer blossoms. Blake felt lighter than he had in years, unburdened by the constant need to project the image of Blake Reynolds, privileged heir. Thank you, he said as they reached Elena's modest sedan. For dinner and for... He gestured vaguely, searching for words. For not letting you buy your way out of your community service? Elena suggested with a teasing smile. Blake laughed. For seeing something in me worth believing in. Not many people have. Elena's expression grew serious. You're more than your family name or your bank account, Blake. I think you're just starting to realize that. The moment between them stretched, charged with unspoken possibilities. Blake found himself drawn toward her, wanting to bridge the remaining distance. Elena stepped back slightly, regret in her eyes. You're still completing your service requirement, she reminded him gently. And I'm still responsible for signing off on your hours. Blake nodded, understanding the boundary she was setting. Rain check, then? Let's focus on getting through the science competition and your formal service completion, Elena suggested. Then we can talk about rain checks. As Blake drove home, he replayed their evening in his mind. For the first time in his adult life, he'd spent hours with someone who challenged him intellectually and morally, who saw through his practiced charm to the person he could become. His apartment felt even emptier than usual that night. Blake wandered through the expensively decorated rooms, seeing them with new eyes. There was nothing personal here, nothing that reflected passion or purpose, just expensive taste and careful curation. On impulse, he opened his laptop and began researching Reynolds' innovations more thoroughly than he ever had before. His father's company had started small, developing software solutions for small businesses. As it grew, it had diversified, eventually becoming the technology giant it was today. Blake dug deeper, finding articles about the company's early days, when Richard Reynolds had been known for his commitment to creating jobs in underserved communities. Somewhere along the way, that commitment had been overshadowed by profit margins and shareholder value. Blake sat back, thoughtful. Perhaps there was a way to honor both his father's legacy and his own emerging values. Perhaps Reynolds' innovations could be more than just a source of dividends for him. It could be a vehicle for the change he now found himself wanting to create. The science competition arrived quickly. Blake rented a large passenger van as promised, picking up Zoe and 7 other excited children early Saturday morning. Elena rode shotgun, clipboard in hand as she checked attendance and permission slips with her usual efficiency. Everyone has their projects secured? She called to the back of the van. A chorus of affirmative responses came back, accompanied by the sound of children chattering about equations and hypotheses. Blake caught Elena's eye, sharing a smile at their enthusiasm. The competition was held at a prestigious private school, with facilities that made Oakridge look woefully underfunded by comparison. Blake noticed the children's wide eyes as they took in the state-of-the-art science labs and gleaming hallways. Stay focused, Elena encouraged them. Your projects are just as good as anyone else's. You've worked hard and prepared well. As the children set up their displays, Blake found himself genuinely nervous for them, particularly Zoe, whose renewable energy model had become increasingly sophisticated with his help. What if the judges don't understand my project? Zoe worried, adjusting her display one last time. Then explain it to them clearly, just like you've practiced, Blake advised. Remember, you know this material better than anyone. The judging took several hours. Blake and Elena moved between the Oakridge children, offering encouragement and support. Blake found himself impressed by the depth of knowledge each child displayed, regardless of their project's complexity. When the announcements finally came, the Oakridge group huddled together, holding hands nervously. Miguel won an honorable mention for his mathematics project. 2 other children received recognition in their categories, and Zoe won first place in the environmental science division. Her face when they called her name was something Blake knew he would never forget. Pure joy, disbelief, and pride all mingled together as she walked to the podium to receive her certificate and medal. As the children celebrated their success on the drive back, singing and laughing in the van, Blake glanced at Elena. She was watching them in the rearview mirror, tears of pride glistening in her eyes. You did this, Blake said quietly, so only she could hear. You made this possible for them. Elena shook her head. We all did. It takes a community. She looked at him directly. Including you, Blake. Especially you, today. The warmth of her approval settled in his chest, more satisfying than any accolade he'd ever received. Something fundamental had shifted in Blake's understanding of what mattered, of what success truly meant. It wasn't about yachts or luxury apartments or exclusive clubs. It was about the light in a child's eyes when they accomplished something they'd worked hard for, It was about being part of something larger than himself. As they unloaded at the community center, parents waiting to hear about the competition, Blake realized with a start that his court-mandated service was officially complete. After today, he had no obligation to return to Oakridge. The thought left him feeling strangely bereft. In just 4 weeks, this place and these people had become important to him in ways he couldn't have imagined on that first reluctant day. Zoe rushed to show her grandmother the medal, chattering excitedly about the judges, comments, and the university representatives who had spoken to her afterward. "Blake helped me fix the solar panel angle," she explained, pointing to him. "He knows a lot about science stuff." Zoe's grandmother, a dignified woman with silver-streaked hair, approached Blake with a warm smile. "Thank you for encouraging her. Zoe talks about you all the time." Blake felt unexpectedly moved. "She's brilliant. I just provided an extra pair of hands." "Sometimes that's all our children need," the woman said wisely. "Someone who believes they can fly." As the families dispersed and the excitement of the day began to settle, Blake found himself alone with Elena in her office. She was filling out his final service verification form, her pen moving efficiently across the paper. 80 hours, completed satisfactorily, she said, signing the document with a flourish. "You're officially free, Blake Reynolds." He accepted the form, their fingers brushing briefly. "What if I don't want to be free?" Elena looked up, surprise evident in her expression. "What do you mean? What if I want to keep volunteering? Help with the gala planning, maybe even join the board eventually?" The words surprised Blake almost as much as they seemed to surprise Elena. Yet he knew with sudden clarity that he meant them. "That would be—" Elena searched for words. "Unexpected. And appreciated." "There's something else," Blake said, gathering his courage. "Now that you're not my supervisor, how about that rain check?" A slow smile spread across Elena's face. "I think that could be arranged." As they locked up the center together, plans for dinner the following evening already made, Blake looked back at the modest building that had changed the course of his life. The sign still needed repainting, the garden bed still needed weeding, and the funding was still inadequate. But inside those walls, children found purpose and possibility. Inside those walls, Blake Reynolds had found the same. 3 months after the science competition, autumn painted Oakridge Community Center in brilliant shades of gold and crimson. Blake stood in the renovated computer lab, watching as children explored the new equipment with expressions of wonder. 10 brand-new computers lined the walls, replacing the outdated machines that had frequently crashed mid-homework. "Miguel, remember to save your work every few minutes," Blake reminded a boy who was typing furiously on a research paper. Miguel nodded without looking up, completely absorbed in his task. His progress in math had been remarkable over the past months, his confidence growing alongside his skills. The computer lab renovation had been Blake's first major contribution as the newest member of Oakridge's board of directors. He'd not only secured the equipment through corporate donations, but had personally installed everything alongside Ramon, learning about wiring and networking in the process. "Looking good in here," Elena said, appearing in the doorway with a stack of permission slips. Her hair was pulled back in her usual practical ponytail, though Blake had discovered she wore it down when they weren't at the center. He preferred it that way, falling in soft waves around her face. But there was something endearing about her work style, too. "The kids can't believe how fast these machines are," Blake replied, crossing the room to join her. "Zoe said it's like going from a bicycle to a rocket ship." Elena laughed. "Speaking of Zoe, have you heard her news?" "What news?" "Her science project caught the attention of the STEM Scholarship Committee. They want to feature her in their annual fundraising video." Pride swelled in Blake's chest. "That's incredible. She deserves it." "She wants you there for the filming," Elena added. "She says you're her science mentor." The title caught Blake by surprise. He'd spent countless hours helping Zoe refine her renewable energy project after the competition, expanding it for the regional science fair next month. But mentor? The responsibility of that role hadn't fully registered until now. "I'd be honored," he said sincerely. Elena checked her watch. "The board meeting starts in 15 minutes. You ready for your big proposal?" Blake straightened his tie. a gesture of nervousness he hadn't quite shed despite his growing comfort at Oakridge. "As ready as I'll ever be." Your edit suggestions helped a lot. Their relationship had evolved gradually over the past months. Professional collaboration had given way to friendship, and friendship had blossomed into something deeper. They still maintained appropriate boundaries at the center, but evenings and weekends were theirs, exploring the city's hidden gems, discussing books and ideas, discovering the people behind their professional personas. The board meeting convened in the center's modest conference room. Blake took his seat among the 8 directors, still feeling like the newcomer, despite his 3 months of service. Most board members were community leaders or longtime supporters, a retired teacher, a local business owner, a civil rights attorney. They had initially viewed Blake with skepticism, a wealthy outsider fulfilling a court requirement. He'd worked hard to earn their respect. "Next agenda item," said Mrs. Washington, the board chair and retired principal, "Blake's proposal for the annual fundraising gala." Blake distributed the folders he'd prepared, then stood. "As you know, our gala is 6 weeks away. Traditionally, it raises about $10,000, barely enough to fund the summer program." He clicked to the first slide of his presentation. "I believe we can do better, much better." For the next 15 minutes, Blake outlined his vision, a reimagined gala at the city's botanical gardens, donated by a business contact, live music from a local jazz band, whose leader had attended Oakridge as a child, catering partially donated by Antonio's Pizzeria and other neighborhood restaurants, a robust silent auction featuring experiences and items from both local businesses and corporate donors. Bottom line, Blake concluded, "I believe we can raise $50,000, 5 times our usual amount, without compromising the community focus that makes this event special." Silence fell as board members reviewed his detailed budget and planning documents. Mrs. Washington peered at him over her reading glasses. "This is ambitious, Mr. Reynolds. What makes you think corporate donors will suddenly take interest in our little center?" Blake had anticipated this question. 3 factors. First, I've leveraged personal and family connections to secure commitments from several major businesses. He didn't mention the heated arguments with his father this had prompted. Second, we're packaging sponsorships to highlight the center's proven impact on educational outcomes. Companies want measurable results for their charitable giving. He paused, then added the most important point. Third, we're not just asking for handouts, we're offering partnerships. Every corporate sponsor will have opportunities for meaningful engagement with our programs. Their employees can volunteer, their expertise can enhance our offerings, and they'll see firsthand how their support changes lives. Elena spoke up from her position at the end of the table. "Blake has already secured 10 confirmed corporate sponsors and 15 silent auction donations." The pride in her voice warmed him. "This isn't speculative. The groundwork is laid." Discussion erupted around the table. Some board members voiced concerns about changing the gala's character. Others worried about the increased workload for staff. Blake addressed each point patiently, emphasizing that additional volunteers would handle much of the new work. Finally, Mrs. Washington called for a vote. The proposal passed unanimously. "Congratulations, Mr. Reynolds," she said with the hint of a smile. "You've set an ambitious target. Now we'll see if you can deliver." After the meeting, Blake and Elena walked to the small park across from the center. The evening air carried the crisp scent of fallen leaves as they settled on one of the benches Blake had painted during his first week. A lifetime ago, it seemed. "That went well," Elena said, bumping her shoulder against his playfully. "Better than I expected," Blake admitted. "I thought Mrs. Washington would be a harder sell." "She likes you more than she lets on. You've proven yourself these past months." Blake ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Elena had come to recognize as his processing something significant. "I never thought I'd care so much about a fundraiser, or a community center, or—" He looked at her, his expression softening. "Any of this?" Elena took his hand, their fingers intertwining naturally. "Life has a way of surprising us. When you walked into my office that first day, the last thing I expected was—" She gestured between them. "This." Blake laughed. "You thought I was a spoiled rich kid looking for an easy way out." "You were a spoiled rich kid looking for an easy way out." Elena corrected with a smile that took any sting from the words. Fair point. What changed your mind? Elena considered the question seriously. It wasn't one moment. It was watching you with the children. The way you listened to Zoe about sanding those benches. How you helped Miguel with his math without making him feel stupid. She squeezed his hand. You showed up, Blake. Day after day, you showed up and did the work. Not just the physical labor, but the harder work of connecting, of caring. Blake was silent for a moment, absorbing her words. I have a meeting with my father tomorrow, he said finally, about joining the company. Elena looked surprised. You haven't mentioned this before. I wasn't sure I'd go through with it, Blake admitted. The company always represented everything I was trying to avoid. Responsibility, expectations, following in his footsteps. What changed? Blake gestured toward the community center. This place, these kids, you. He met her eyes directly. I've realized that wealth and privilege aren't inherently bad. It's what you do with them that matters. My father's company has resources that could make a real difference for communities like this one. And you want to be part of that? I want to lead it, Blake said with newfound conviction. Not tomorrow, but eventually. Reynolds Innovations started as a company with a social conscience. Somewhere along the way, it lost that. I want to bring it back. Elena studied him, her expression thoughtful. That's a big vision. Your father might not share it. Probably not, Blake agreed, but it's worth fighting for. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell, the streetlights casting a warm glow over the park. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight was theirs. A moment of quiet connection before the next chapter began. Richard Reynolds sat behind his imposing desk, examining the business proposal Blake had presented with the same critical eye he applied to acquisition targets. Blake waited, trying not to fidget like a schoolboy in the principal's office. Your numbers are solid, Richard said finally, setting down the document. Your market analysis shows unexpected insight. He removed his reading glasses. What I don't understand is why Reynolds Innovations should divert resources to create a corporate social responsibility division now, when our focus is international expansion. Blake had anticipated this objection. It's not diversion, it's investment. Studies show companies with strong social responsibility programs outperform their competitors by an average of 17% over 5 years. We could just write checks to charities. Much simpler. Checks don't build customer loyalty or employee engagement, Blake countered. Meaningful community involvement does. Look at these satisfaction metrics from companies with embedded social programs. Richard studied the charts Blake presented, his expression giving nothing away. This proposal would require significant restructuring. New personnel. New priorities. I'm willing to build it from the ground up, Blake said. Start small, prove the concept, then scale. His father leaned back, studying him with new interest. 3 months ago, you were facing a judge for sinking a security boat while trying to race your yacht into the marina after midnight. Now you're presenting business proposals with 5-year projections. He shook his head slightly. What happened? The question caught Blake off guard. He'd prepared for financial objections, strategic concerns, even outright rejection, but not genuine curiosity about his transformation. I grew up, Blake said simply. Then, realizing the inadequacy of that explanation, he added, At Oakridge, I saw what real impact looks like. Not abstract charitable giving, but direct involvement that changes lives. It made me realize what Reynolds Innovations could be if we reconnected with your original vision. My original vision? Richard's eyebrows rose. Blake pulled out a framed newspaper article he'd brought for precisely this moment. It showed a much younger Richard Reynolds standing outside his first office, a converted warehouse in what was now the Oakridge neighborhood. The headline read, Local entrepreneur creates jobs in underserved community. You started the company to make a difference, not just a profit, Blake said, placing the article on the desk between them. I want to honor that legacy while taking it into the future. Something shifted in Richard's expression, a softening around the eyes, a slight easing of the perpetual furrow in his brow. Come with me, he said abruptly, standing. Confused, Blake followed his father out of the office and into the private elevator. They rode in silence to the building's top floor, a space Blake had rarely visited. Richard used a key card to access a set of double doors. revealing a cavernous room filled with covered furniture and stacked boxes. "The company archives," Richard explained, moving purposefully through the space. "Most of this should probably be digitized, but I'm old-fashioned about some things." He stopped at a large object covered with a protective cloth, pulling it away to reveal a detailed architectural model of an urban neighborhood. Blake moved closer, recognizing the layout of the Oakridge district, though depicted with modern buildings and green spaces that didn't exist in reality. "What is this?" Blake asked. "My original plan for the neighborhood where we started," Richard said, his voice uncharacteristically reflective. "Mixed-income housing, business incubators, community facilities, green spaces." He ran a hand along the edge of the model. "We were going to reinvest a percentage of profits into revitalizing the area where our first employees lived." "What happened?" Richard's expression hardened slightly. "Reality. The recession of 108, taking the company public. Shareholder demands." He shrugged. "We shifted focus to survival, then growth. The neighborhood plan was shelved." Blake studied the model, seeing it with new eyes. Not just an abandoned business project, but a dream deferred. "It's not too late," he said quietly. "For this specific plan? Probably is," Richard replied pragmatically. "But for the principle behind it?" He turned to face his son directly. "Your proposal has merit, Blake. Start small, as you suggested. 3-person team, modest budget reporting directly to me for the first year." Blake blinked, momentarily speechless. "You're approving it?" "Conditionally," Richard clarified. "Prove the concept, show measurable results, and we'll discuss expansion." He replaced the cloth over the model. "Consider it a test of the idea and of you." As they returned to Richard's office to discuss details, Blake felt a strange sense of coming full circle. The community service that was meant to be punishment had led him back to his family's company with new purpose. The center that he'd resented visiting had become the inspiration for his professional future. Later that evening, Blake met Elena at Antonio's pizzeria to share the news. Her genuine excitement for his opportunity touched him deeply. "This is perfect for you," she said, eyes shining. "You'll be amazing at it." "It's just a small start," Blake cautioned. 3 people, limited budget. Every important change starts small, Elena reminded him. Oakridge started with 1 room in a church basement 30 years ago. Blake reached across the table for her hand. "Speaking of Oakridge, how would you feel about Reynolds Innovations becoming a major partner for the center?" Elena's expression turned cautious. "In what way?" "Educational technology. Internship opportunities for the older kids. Funding for program expansion." Blake outlined the vision that had been forming in his mind. Not just for Oakridge, but eventually for centers across the city. "It sounds wonderful," Elena said slowly, "but I'd want to ensure the center maintains its independence and community focus." "Of course," Blake agreed immediately. "This would be support, not a takeover. The community leads, we provide resources." Elena studied him for a long moment, then smiled. "You really have changed, Blake Reynolds. For the better, I hope." "Definitely for the better," she assured him, squeezing his hand. The weeks leading up to the gala were a whirlwind of activity. Blake divided his time between establishing his new division at Reynolds Innovations and finalizing preparations for the fundraiser. Elena and the center staff worked tirelessly alongside him, transforming his ambitious vision into reality. The evening of the gala arrived with perfect autumn weather. The botanical gardens glowed with tasteful lighting, highlighting the fall foliage. Local restaurants had set up stations offering their signature dishes. The silent auction tables displayed everything from weekend getaways to custom artwork created by Oakridge children. Blake adjusted his tie nervously as the first guests began to arrive. He'd insisted on greeting everyone personally, determined to connect the donors with the center's mission. "Stop fidgeting," Elena murmured beside him. She looked stunning in a deep blue dress that she'd admitted to splurging on for the occasion. "Everything is perfect. What if we don't reach the target? Blake worried. I promised the board $50,000. Elena took his hand briefly. Whatever we raise tonight is more than we had yesterday. That's a win. Her perspective steadied him as it had so many times over the past months. Blake straightened his shoulders and turned to welcome the arriving guests with renewed confidence. The evening progressed beautifully. Corporate executives mingled with neighborhood families. Children from the center's programs gave guided tours, proudly showing off displays of their work. Zoe, wearing a dress with solar-powered LED accents she'd designed herself, became the unexpected star of the evening, confidently explaining her renewable energy project to fascinated donors. Blake was speaking with a potential major donor when he noticed his father enter the garden. Richard Reynolds cut an impressive figure in his tailored suit, commanding attention without effort. Blake excused himself and crossed to greet him, surprised and somewhat wary. "Dad, I didn't expect you." "Your assistant mentioned it was tonight," Richard said, surveying the gathering with an appraising eye. "Impressive turnout." "Thanks for coming," Blake said, meaning it despite his nervousness. "Let me introduce you to some people." He guided his father through the crowd, introducing him to board members, staff, and families whose children attended the center. Richard was surprisingly engaged, asking thoughtful questions about programs and impact. When they reached Zoe's display, her eyes widened in recognition. "You're Blake's dad," she said matter-of-factly. "You look like him, but older." Richard chuckled, caught off guard by her directness. "I am indeed. And you must be Zoe. Blake has mentioned your scientific achievements. Do you want to see how my solar energy system works?" she asked, not waiting for an answer before launching into her demonstration. Blake watched with amazement as his father, who routinely cut off Fortune 500 CEOs mid-presentation, listened attentively to an 11-year-old's explanation of renewable energy. Richard even asked follow-up questions that showed genuine interest. "You have a remarkable mind, young lady," Richard said when she finished. "The world needs more thinkers like you," Zoe beamed. "Blake's been helping me. He knows a lot about science stuff." Richard's gaze shifted to his son, something like surprise, or perhaps reassessment, in his expression. "Yes, I suppose he does." As the evening continued, Blake eventually found himself alone with Elena near the garden's central fountain. The fundraising total had already surpassed $40,000, with the final auction items still being tallied. "We're going to hit the target," Elena said, her voice filled with wonder. "Maybe even exceed it." Blake felt a surge of pride, not for himself, but for what they had accomplished together. "This is just the beginning," he promised. "Wait until you see what we can do next year." Elena studied him in the soft garden lighting. "You're planning to stay involved with Oakridge long-term, then?" "As long as you'll have me," Blake said, then clarified. "Both professionally and personally." A slow smile spread across Elena's face. "That might be a very long time, Blake Reynolds." "I'm counting on it," he replied softly. Their moment was interrupted by Mrs. Washington, who approached with barely contained excitement. "The final numbers are in," she announced. $62,000, plus pledges for in-kind donations worth at least another $15,000. Elena gasped. "That's nearly 8 times our usual amount. The board has unanimously voted to allocate the additional funds to expanding our teen mentorship program and establishing a college scholarship fund," Mrs. Washington continued. She fixed Blake with a direct gaze that held newfound respect. "You delivered on your promise, Mr. Reynolds? And then some." As Mrs. Washington moved away to share the news with other board members, Blake found himself approached by his father. "I need to head out," Richard said. "Early meeting tomorrow." Blake nodded, extending his hand. "Thanks for coming." Instead of shaking the offered hand, Richard pulled his son into a brief but firm embrace, a gesture so unexpected that Blake momentarily froze. "You found your place," Richard said quietly. "It took me years to find mine. I'm proud of you, son." Before Blake could respond, Richard stepped back, nodded respectfully to Elena, and departed, leaving Blake staring after him in stunned silence. "Are you okay?" Elena asked, touching his arm gently. Blake turned to her, processing what had just happened. He's never said that before. That he's proud of me. Elena squeezed his arm. He should be. I am. As the gala wound down, Blake found himself standing at the garden's edge, looking out over the gathered community. Board members chatted with corporate donors about future collaborations. Children showed off their projects to impressed adults. Staff members and volunteers celebrated their success with well-deserved pride. From his vantage point, Blake could see all the connections forming bridges between worlds that rarely intersected. The wealthy executive learning from the child scientist. The corporate lawyer offering pro bono services to the center. The tech company pledging internships for Oakridge teens. This was what he had envisioned when proposing his new division at Reynolds Innovations. Not charity, but partnership. Not handouts, but hand-ups. Not separate worlds, but a community strengthened by diverse contributions. Elena joined him, slipping her hand into his. "Penny, for your thoughts." "I was just thinking about that first day at Oakridge," Blake said, "when I offered to pay you to sign off on my community service hours without actually doing the work." Elena laughed. "You were horrible." "I was," he agreed readily. "I had everything and valued nothing." "And now?" Blake looked at her, at the community they'd helped build, at the future opening before them. "Now I understand what wealth really is. It's not what you have. It's what you give." Elena leaned into him, her head resting against his shoulder. "Speaking of giving, Zoe asked if you'd mentor her science club next semester. Apparently you know a lot about science stuff." "I'd be honored," Blake said sincerely. "Though I think I learn more from her than she does from me." As they stood together watching the successful evening come to a close, Blake felt a sense of peace he'd never known before. The path ahead wouldn't be easy. Changing corporate culture rarely was, and balancing his new responsibilities would take work. But for the first time in his life, Blake Reynolds was exactly where he was meant to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. The spoiled son who had arrived at Oakridge Community Center 3 months ago, resentful and entitled, had found purpose in the most unexpected place. And in finding purpose, he had found himself not defined by his family, name or bank account, but by the lives he touched and the community he served. "Ready to go?" Elena asked as the last guests departed. Blake looked at the woman who had seen his potential when he couldn't see it himself. At the community center that had changed his life, at the future they were building together. "Ready," he said, and meant it with his whole heart. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.